Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a really fascinating look at the actual legal boundaries of the workday. Specifically, we're diving into Chapter 6 of the Factories Act of 1948. This right here is the absolute bedrock of labor law. It dictates exactly how long we can work, when we legally must rest, and, maybe most importantly, how we get paid for those extra miles we put in.
But think about it for a second. Do you know exactly how many hours your boss can legally make you work in a single day? We all know the feeling of a brutally long shift, right? But where does the law actually draw the line between a hard day's work and a totally illegal demand? Well, consider your own workday for a moment, and let's see how it measures up against the real legal limits we're about to explore. Okay, let's just dive right into this. We're going to take a week-in-the-life journey today. We'll start with the daily clock, move to the weekly cap, cover weekends and holidays, navigate shifts and double employment, and finish up with the big one, the overtime payoff. All right, jumping into part 1, the daily clock. We're looking at daily limits and mandatory rest intervals. 9 hours. That number is absolute. Section 54 of the Act clearly states that no adult worker shall be required, or frankly even allowed, to work in a factory for more than exactly 9 hours in any single day. That is the hard legal ceiling for actual labor. But here's the catch. You can't just be asked to work those 9 hours straight through. The law actually builds in mandatory breaks. Under Section 55, which is often known as the 5-hour rule, a workday has to be structured so that you literally cannot push past 5 hours of continuous labor without taking a rest interval of at least half an hour. It's a fundamental right to just rest and recharge. Let's put this into a real-world timeline to see how it frames your entire day. Let's say you start a shift at 9 a.m. You take your mandatory 30-minute break at 2 p.m., and then you'll hit your 9 hours of actual labor at 7:30 p.m. Section 56 calls this the spread over. The law dictates that a shift, including all of your rest time, cannot spread over more than 10.5 hours total. Basically, your employer can't just stretch your workday out with massive, unpaid breaks to keep you trapped on the premises all day long.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit for Section 2, the weekly cap. Understanding your 48-hour limit.
So, just like 9 hours is your daily limit, Section 51 acts as your ultimate weekly shield. It strictly protects workers from being required or allowed to work more than 48 hours in any given week. And this is key. Even if you work fewer than 9 hours on some days, the very second your weekly total hits 48, the standard clock stops, period. But, how rigid is this in actual practice? What's really interesting is seeing how these absolute limits are tested in reality. In a 2009 Delhi High Court case, Richa and Company versus Shri Suresh Chand, the court had to decide on a marginal extension. They held that an increase of merely 15 minutes of working time would not be considered a violation of the 48-hour rule. So, it shows that while the law is undeniably strict, courts do sometimes interpret incredibly minor deviations with a degree of practical leniency.
Moving right along to Section 3, weekends and holidays. This is all about guarding your hard-earned time off.
Generally speaking, the first day of the week, which is Sunday, is a protected holiday under Section 52. Now, to actually make a factory employee work on a Sunday, an employer must meet some incredibly strict criteria. First, they have to give the worker a substituted full-day holiday within 3 days before or after that Sunday. On top of that, the factory manager must deliver a formal notice to the inspector detailing this intention, and they have to display that notice clearly, right out in the open in the factory.
Now, what's really fascinating here is a quote from the 1964 Motor and Machinery Manufacturers case. See, some employers tried to use those substitution rules to permanently erase weekends entirely. The court actually stepped in and legally halted them. They stated that employers cannot, at their, quote, sweet will, continuously convert successive Sundays into working days. The exception absolutely cannot become the rule.
But what happens if, due to some urgent exemptions, you actually do end up losing your weekly holiday entirely? Well, Section 53 provides a safety net. If you are deprived of a weekly holiday, you are legally entitled to a compensatory holiday of an equal number of days. And the law is super specific on the timeline here. You must be granted this time off within the same month those holidays were due, or within the 2 months immediately following. It basically ensures your rest is delayed, not denied.
All right, Section 4, shifts and double employment. This is where we get into midnight shifts and multiple jobs. If you work a standard 9 to 5, the calendar day is pretty straightforward. But let me ask you this. What happens if your shift crosses midnight? When does your day actually end? And more importantly, when does your legally mandated weekly holiday officially begin?
Well, Section 57 breaks down this precise accounting of hours. If you work past midnight, your mandatory weekly holiday is defined as a period of 24 consecutive hours, beginning exactly when your shift ends. Plus, for record-keeping purposes, the hours you work before midnight count toward the previous day, and the hours after count toward the new day. This really specific logic ensures that midnight shift workers still get their full, uninterrupted 24-hour holiday just like everybody else.
And to prevent any kind of chaos or exploitation, Section 58 explicitly bans overlapping shift systems. Work literally cannot be arranged so that more than one relay of workers is engaged in the exact same kind of work at the same time. The structure has to be crystal clear. Building on this need for clear boundaries, Section 60 imposes a restriction against double employment, meaning an adult worker cannot be required or allowed to work in two different factories on the exact same day.
Let's move to the part everyone cares about. Section 5, the overtime payoff, getting paid for extra hours. Now, before we even calculate overtime, we have to understand the baseline. The ordinary rate of wages is strictly defined by law as your basic wages plus your allowances, and this even includes the cash equivalent of food grain concessions. But it specifically excludes bonuses and previous overtime wages. And what about workers paid on a piece rate basis? The law dictates their rate is the daily average of full-time earnings from the previous month. This ensures a perfectly fair baseline is set before a single hour of overtime is multiplied. So, here is the crucial point to take away from all this. As we established, your standard limit is up to 9 hours a day or 48 hours a week paid at your ordinary rate. But under Section 59, the absolute moment you cross either of those thresholds, more than 9 hours in a day or more than 48 hours in a week, you are entitled to overtime. And that overtime must be paid at twice your ordinary rate of wages, not time and a half, double pay. Literally twice your ordinary rate.
And if an employer tries to view this as, optional, the courts have been absolutely crystal clear. In the 1997 National Textiles Corporation case, the court firmly established that Section 59 creates a strict, binding obligation on the employer to pay extra wages for overtime. This is not a perk, it's not a bonus, and it is certainly not at the manager's discretion. It is a strict legal obligation.
Okay, so I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's explainer. We're going to take a virtual factory floor walkthrough of the Factories Act 1948. We're zeroing in on the strict legal provisions surrounding registers, working hours, and demographics. If you're prepping for those written exams, you are in exactly the right spot. We're going to take these, well, let's be honest, kind of dry legal sections and ground them into a real-world narrative. That way, on exam day, you'll be able to recall these rules with absolute precision. Let's get to it.
Here's our visual syllabus for today. First, we'll look at registering adult workers. Then we'll move right into the rules for women workers. After that, we'll map out the boundaries for young persons and adolescents, unpack the whole certificate of fitness process, and finally, lock down child hours and registers.
All right, Part 1, registering adult workers, which falls under Section 62 of the Factories Act.
To really make this stick, I want you to imagine our first persona, Raj. He's an adult shift worker. Now, the literal second Raj steps through those factory gates, Section 62 kicks in. It dictates that the manager absolutely must maintain a register showing Raj's name, the exact nature of his work, his group, and, because he works in shifts, his specific relay. Mentally highlight these bullets, guys. If an exam asks for the components of an adult worker register under Section 62, boom, this is your definitive answer.
Moving on to Part 2. Rules for women workers, specifically the limitations in Section 66.
For this one, let's introduce our second persona, Priya. She's a female factory worker. Now, while Priya is an adult, Section 66 supplements her general rules with some very strict limitations. The standard, non-negotiable rule here, no woman shall be allowed to work in any factory except between the hours of 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. Okay, but wait, there's a catch. The state government actually does have the power to authorize exceptions, but only between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m.
Beyond just the hours, there's one more absolutely critical constraint under Section 66. Shift changes for women are strictly prohibited, except after a weekly holiday or any other holiday. I'm emphasizing this because, honestly, exam questions love to try and trick students on this exact point. They might throw a scenario at you where a manager changes a female worker's shift midweek because of some emergency. The legal answer, absolutely prohibited. Shift changes only happen after a holiday. Keep that in your back pocket.
Okay, part 3, Young Persons and Adolescents. This is Chapter 7, covering Sections 67 and 68. Before we even get to adolescence, we have to look at the absolute bottom line set by Section 67. The law states, very clearly, that absolutely no child who has not completed their 14th year shall be required or allowed to work in any factory. Period. This is a strict, non-negotiable legal boundary. Under age 14, no factory work. Full stop. Now, let me introduce you to Arjun. He's an eager 15-year-old. Since he has completed his 14th year, the law considers him an adolescent. Section 68 lays out the shared responsibility for him to actually be able to legally work. It's kind of like a two-part puzzle. The manager must hold the actual physical certificate of fitness in their custody, while Arjun must carry a token referencing that certificate while he's at work. Both of these conditions have to be met at the exact same time. Which brings us to Part 4, the Certificate of Fitness, covering the procedures in Section 69. So you're probably wondering, how does Arjun actually get that certificate? Well, it's a 3-step process. First, an application is made. This can be by the young person, a parent, or the manager, but it has to be accompanied by a document proving factory employment. Second, there's a strict medical examination conducted by a certifying surgeon. And third, based on that exam, the surgeon will either grant or renew the certificate, depending on the worker's age and physical fitness. Now, the certifying surgeon actually has 2 completely distinct tiers of certification they can hand out. To be certified to work as a child, the person must have completed their 14th year and met the prescribed physical standards for that specific work. But to be certified to work as an adult, they must have completed their 15th year and be fit for a full day's work in a factory. Examiners will absolutely test if you know the difference between completing the 14th versus the 15th year and the different stamina requirements, so definitely mark this one down. Okay, so the crucial point here is this list of administrative rules surrounding the certificate. It is only valid for 12 months from the date of issue. The surgeon retains the power to revoke it if the holder becomes unfit, and they actually must provide written reasons if they refuse to issue one. But pay close attention to this final detail, because it's a big one. The occupier of the factory pays the fee. That cost can never, under any circumstances, be recovered from the young person or their parents. Almost there. Part 5, Child Hours and Registers, found in Sections 71 and 73. So, for a child worker, the absolute maximum allowed working time per day is 4.5 hours, and that time cannot be spread over more than 5 hours total for the shift. On top of that, their work is strictly limited to 2 shifts, which shall not overlap, and each child can only be employed in one single relay. No exceptions to this rule whatsoever. Furthermore, Section 71 has a highly specific rule when it comes to female children. No female child shall be allowed to work in any factory except between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. Now, I want you to contrast this 8 a.m. start time with the 6 a.m. standard start time we discussed earlier for adult women under Section 66. That 2-hour difference? Yeah, that's a prime target for examiners looking to test your attention to detail. Now, what's really interesting here is how the law builds upon itself. Section 73 mandates a register of child workers. It requires all the exact same details as the adult register we saw way back in Section 62, so name, nature of work, group, and shift relay. But there is one critical extra detail. The manager must also record the number of the child's certificate of fitness that was granted under Section 69. All right, let's pause for a second to test your attention with a tricky mock exam question. Can a 13-year-old legally work in a factory if they obtain a perfectly valid certificate of fitness from a certifying surgeon? Take a second, think about the sections we just covered. And the answer is an emphatic, absolute no. Remember, Section 67 completely prohibits the employment of any child who has not completed their 14th year. That age boundary is absolute, regardless of their physical fitness. Memorizing how these rigid sections interact will absolutely guarantee your success on those written exams. But, beyond just passing the test, it kind of makes you wonder. As our modern industries rapidly evolve with things like automation and AI, how are these foundational 1948 protections going to need to adapt for the factory floors of the future? Something to think about. Anyway, thanks for joining me on this explainer, and happy studying.